Well, for more on the state of U.S. media, we go live now to Newton, Massachusetts to join Joshua Benton. He's the director of the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So what do all these recent layoffs at media companies tell us about what's happening in the industry overall?
Well, you mentioned the positive results for the New York Times, and I think the key divide there is whether you're relying on digital advertising or on digital circulation, payments from readers. The New York Times now has over 3 million people paying as digital subscribers, and that's become a very steady, very lucrative revenue stream for them. On the advertising side, the signs are not nearly as good. About 70% of all digital advertising in the United States outside of China goes to either Facebook or Google. And third place is Amazon, another technology company. They've essentially squeezed out publishers, so companies like BuzzFeed and Vice that were going to be relying on advertising revenue are having a real struggle.
So then in terms of where companies are now spending their money, how does this trend in the U.S. compare to what's happening in the global media landscape?
Well, I think in the United States, the advertising market has been a little bit more thoroughly disrupted by programmatic advertising, the sort of advertising that is very data-driven and is sold primarily by Google and Facebook. In other countries in Europe, for example, in Germany, subscriptions have held on more strongly than they have in the United States. Other countries, of course, have stronger histories of public service media, something like the BBC or the CBC, that provide a different sort of role within the marketplace. The United States is somewhat uniquely vulnerable to these sorts of changes, not least because most of our reporters are in local newspapers. There are about 1,300 newspapers in the United States, and only 4 of them are national. So the 4, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the USA Today, they're just in a different business than most other newspapers, which is where most of the news gets created.
So you mentioned this sort of divide between how media companies are viewed and the sort of targets they're going after. What are some of the old guard doing about these changes that they're seeing in the media landscape?
Well, the sort of old guard, Condé Nast, New York Times, the Washington Post, they've all bet on readers paying the price. In the old model, 80% of American newspaper revenue came from advertisers. Now, increasingly, the majority of revenue is going to be coming directly from readers. Condé Nast, the leading magazine company, which runs the New Yorker and Wired magazine and Vanity Fair, they announced last month, I should say, that they're going to be putting up paywalls and charging for all of their magazines. Essentially, you're splitting the media system into a premium tier that's going to cost money to access and a free tier that's not going to be as good.
Now, on top of that, you also have social media companies like Facebook as becoming an increasing source for news for people. What are the pros and cons of that, though?
Well, there's actually some evidence that trend might be reversing a bit. When you go to consume news from a television broadcast, a radio broadcast, a newspaper, you're seeing an edited product. You're seeing the decisions of editors and producers on what are the most important stories. There's some sort of order and structure to it. When you're seeing news on social media, you're certainly not seeing an edited product. You're seeing a somewhat random assemblage of stories that your friends might have shared or people you follow on Twitter might have shared. There's not as much of a rhyme or reason to it. And that means that it's a lot easier for false stories or hyper-partisan stories or just misleading stories to find their way in.
And so what are companies doing to limit the spread of misinformation or fact-checked faster, especially given how quickly some of this fake news can spread?
Well, Facebook has made a number of efforts. They've already tried and realized it didn't work and reversed them. They have fact-checking partnerships with a number of news organizations in the United States and a small number of other countries around the world, where these fact-checking organizations can say, hey, this story that's spreading is clearly false, and that can allow Facebook to deter its spread. On other networks such as Twitter, the main question is trying to find the bad actors, the bots, the intelligence agencies, and other people who are trying to influence the discourse. But thus far, it's not really been a winning battle. It's a tough hill to climb.
Now, speaking of robots in a more positive sense, we know that according to the New York Times, about a third of the content published by Bloomberg News uses some form of automated technology, whether it's dissecting financial reports and data, etc. And we also know that China's Xinhua tried out an artificial intelligence news anchor. Just how much is tech reshaping the new media landscape?
I think that the actual elements of artificial intelligence and news creation are fairly limited right now. Bloomberg does use AI technology to generate stories quite a bit. Reuters does as well. What they have in common is that these are largely business-driven services that have highly structured data in the form of earnings reports primarily. Another area where you see robot-written reporting is in the American sport of baseball. Baseball is very much encoded into a box score that is all the data that occurred in the game. It's relatively easy for a computer program to generate a story out of it. But we haven't gotten to the point where an algorithm can go cover a city council meeting or cover a campaign rally. Those sorts of things still require humans.
And just quickly, what do all these changes mean, not just for consumers, but also for journalists?
Well, for journalists, it's a tough business right now. It used to be that media was a relatively stable business. Newspapers, were good businesses for a very long time. They made an awful lot of money in the second half of the 20th century. But at this point, it's a lot of journalists when they hear younger people who are interested in going into the field, they're asking, is it really appropriate to advise it? Because there are fewer and fewer jobs every year. On the consumer side, it's really a situation where readers have to be very careful about what they're reading.
All right, thank you, Joshua Benton, Director of the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard University.